the secret to training good machine learning models is almost never iterating on like the next best like mathematical model or the best like new deep learning architecture. The secret is having high quality, clean data.
Welcome. Thank you, Andrei, for joining me. Quick introduction. Andrei is the co-founder of Nomic AI, and Nomic AI is a startup dedicated to making AI more accessible to everyone through data interaction tool Atlas and their open source GPT4All models, which version 2 was just launched yesterday, and we're definitely going to be talking about that. Welcome, Andrei.
Hey Matt, thank you so much. Great to be here.
Cool. So I think first, I would just love to learn a little bit about you. Where were you born? Where'd you grow up? How did you get into technology?
Sure, yeah. So I actually am originally from Ukraine. I was born in Lviv. It's a town, city in western Ukraine. I moved to the U.S. when I was 4. My family won the green card lottery actually to come to the U.S. So I'm an immigrant. And we moved
Very
straight
nice.
to Richmond, Virginia. So this is like a town or a city about an hour south of DC. I grew up my entire life there. I actually at one point wanted to be a YouTuber at one point in my life. But then I picked up Python in like seventh eighth grade and started kind of programming from there. Um, Actually, one of my first ever big projects was I wrote a Minecraft server from scratch. So kind of like got really involved in programming. I ended up going to a high school that sort of focused on like programming and computer science and math. And after that, like sort of like just fell in love with it, and I've been doing that ever since. Um, in college, I got involved with AI. I worked at a natural language processing lab. This was like right before the whole like deep learning meets language craze started in like 2016, 2017. Sort of rode that wave, published some research papers, worked at a startup for a little bit of time, doing like training large language models on medical data. Started a PhD after that, doing interpretable machine learning, and then sort of saw the world moving really fast. Had knowledge of how large language models worked and how to make them work, and just saw that I could make a bigger difference. I think building in the open, building a startup as opposed to doing my PhD, and I dropped out last May and found Novik.
And you mentioned you were doing some early NLP work. What kind of stuff were you working on as at
Yeah,
such a young age?
yeah. I mean, not necessarily young. A lot of people do work in like research labs in their undergrad. So I was specifically working on like structured data extraction from like text documents in my early undergrad. So these things are called it's something called named entity recognition. I was working on that, basically just like under the mentorship of a professor at my undergrad university, learning the ropes. Eventually, got a chance to do an internship at Johns Hopkins under this professor Mark Dredzy. I learned a lot there. That's kind of where I first learned about language models and all of that. That was like 2018, 2019. And that sort of like shot me into this like direction of artificial intelligence as like a career, pretty much.
And so, okay, so you dropped out of your PhD program to found Nomic AI. How did that come about? What problem were you solving? How did you identify that problem? I'm an entrepreneur myself, so I love hearing those kind of the founder stories.
Yeah, yeah. So basically, right when I was finishing undergrad, COVID started, and I was offered this like very, very unique chance to work at an early stage startup, who had a lot of medical data, and they were training a large language model to basically summarize that medical data, and they were presenting it to radiologists. They had like a whole like product built out and everything. And I was put on the team that was actually training the large language model, so like making them do well on at the task at hand. And one of the big problems that you have with training large language models is that large language models they hallucinate. And the reason they hallucinate, there's many of them. One of the core reasons is because of the data they're trained on. There's like spurious correlations in the data. Um, and obviously, if you're building like the medical domain, what happens is if your large language model hallucinates, you don't have a like large language model powered product because in medicine you cannot hallucinate. You can't make things up that'll possibly kill people. So this was like a very, very important problem to work on early on. This was like 2019, pre GPT-3. We were working and try to solve this problem, and we were able to solve it. And the way we were able to solve it is by doing very, very exhaustive, intensive data quality and data cleaning operations over top of the data sets we were training large language models on. So I kind of learned from like a very early point in my like in career that the secret to training good machine learning models is almost never iterating on like the next best like mathematical model or the best like new deep learning architecture. The secret is having high quality, clean data. Um,
Right.
and I left that startup after about a year. I learned a lot, met some really great people there, and then would start my PhD. And I sort of saw the world was moving really, really fast. And everyone was starting to realize that large language models are going to be this new foundation that the future of computing gets built on. And I knew a lot about them, and I wasn't really leveraging it. So I met up with one of my old coworkers from that startup I worked at, and we were just like, hey, like we know this secret that no one else knows. The secret is the data. Let's build something that allows people to very easily go in and curate data for large language model training. Um, yeah, so we kind of
And
kicked.
let me
Yeah.
stop you for a second. So you mentioned spurious correlations in the data. First, what does that mean exactly? What causes those? And then what are the qualities of a really high quality data set?
hmm Yeah. So spurious correlation. This means when you have pieces of data that when you have pieces of data that you train your machine learning model on that allow the model to make connections that it shouldn't be making because it allows the model to make a shortcut in its reasoning to solve the problem that you're trying to solve. So, for example, if you could like one common thing that is a very bad spurious correlation that causes, for example, model biases is when say you're trying to do a task like predicting like somebody's credit score, right? This is something that is an automated process nowadays. These credit score systems that give you a credit score, these are automated models, um, and they condition on like a bunch of attributes of like the human. For instance, like they'll take in like your previous payment history, they'll take in the area you live in.
Hmm.
But oftentimes, like there's very simple attributes that if you don't tell the model to not look at, it can use to start being able to like reject or accept people for loans. For example, like zip code. Zip code is this very like strong razor that you can use to say, okay, if I accept everyone in this zip code and deny everyone in this zip code, we're going to get much better outcomes for our like let's say like credit scoring system. But obviously, that's like not a correlation you want to use because it's going to like marginalize a giant like large groups of people. But that's the kind of correlation the model can very easily make, a spurious correlation that you don't want it to be making when it's doing its end prediction. So when it comes to large language models, they can do this exact same thing because they're trained on large quantities of text, and these spurious correlations exist in there as well.
And so Nomic helps to identify those spurious correlations, but what are the qualities of like how do you tell when you have a really clean, good data set?
Yeah, so there's a couple things, right? So the way people evaluate like the quality of a machine learning model is usually by taking some amount of data that the model has never seen before, that they don't see during training, and then they evaluate that model on there. And there's kind of two forms of evaluation. There's quantitative evaluation, so you can compute a metric like accuracy, just like count up the total number of times the model was right over the total number of times it tried. And then there's
Mhm.
also a qualitative evaluation. So you can have humans look at the model's outputs, for example, rank the model's outputs, and then you can use statistical tests to say like, oh, this model is better than another model because humans found a statistically significant improvement in the model's like qualitative behavior. Now, the problem with large language models is that they produce text. Um, and to evaluate the quality of a model that produces text, it's very hard to use automated metrics. So like accuracy, how do you say the model is right more than not when it's just generating paragraphs of text out? So one of the things that we set out to do is to be able to give people the ability to look at large collections of text in a very easy manner. This is what this tool called Atlas that we set out to build was. It's this tool that's instrumental to number one, looking at the data sets of large language models. Because it shows you immediately what are the contents of those data sets. So you can very easily find, for instance, things that shouldn't be in there. And that's for a domain expert to decide. But that sort of thing it was not possible before, and people would just literally take a million documents of text, sample 100 of them, and just manually read through them. That used to be the
Right.
process.
Wow.
The whole point of building out Atlas is so you can look at all those 1 million documents of text on one screen in a pre-organized view that starts giving you those insights into what could possibly be wrong with your data, so you can make those manipulations before doing like a costly model train, for example.
So I love the tech side of things. Atlas must be dealing with and just enormous amount of data, and being able to visualize that is super impressive. Can you just give a high level overview of the architecture needed to have a product like Atlas?
Yeah. So like I guess the question is, how do you look at tens of millions of documents of text on one screen and make it such that a human can understand what's going on?
Yep.
There's kind of a few components to it. Number one, you need to use the power of AI to do it. So Atlas in the back end is actually mostly AI driven. What happens is data gets uploaded into Atlas, and Atlas turns every single data point with internal machine learning models that it has in the back end into a string of numbers. It's called a vector. So it represents every single piece of text that comes in as an embedding vector. And then what we have in Atlas is a very, very complicated, but also once implemented, very fast and very, very simple method to take that large collection of embedding vectors that every document corresponds to, that corresponds to the set of documents you uploaded, and then project that into 2 dimensions. So it takes this high dimensional space that the neural network views the documents in and shows it to you in 2 dimensions so that a human can interpret it. Atlas is in some sense a method of looking at your data through the eyes of a neural network. And that's what that
Awesome.
two-dimensional map is. Anytime a neural network thinks anytime a neural network thinks 2 pieces of data are similar, the Atlas map reflects that to you, putting the 2 dimensional points in a similar location. And that's how you get the human interpretable view of a neural network over top of your data. And since you have the power of a neural network now to look at your data, you can make the same kind of inferences that the neural network would allow you to make.
What does a typical user of Atlas look like? Who are they within the company? What title do they usually hold? And what does their day to day look like in the product?
Yeah, so like Atlas users, Atlas has grown very much from developer driven growth. Developers find that, oh my god, I have 50,000 documents, I have 100,000 documents that I need to go through because I need to use it in some model train, or I just have this large collection of data sitting around, I don't know what's in it, or I have this like giant AWS S3 bucket with 1 million images, I don't know what images I have. And they naturally find this as a solution to get a sense or get a pulse of like what's in their data set. And a lot of the growth has been really people are uploading like small samples of data. They show it to like their bosses, their project managers, and they're like, "Holy crap! Like this is extremely useful. We finally know what's in our data sets." And Atlas then also gives you sort of like interaction over top of that. So like once your data is in, you can manipulate it. So you can go in and slice and dice the data set, filter it in different ways, and sort of get like a level of interaction just beyond the sort of like exploration over top of the data. And yeah, the kinds of users. So everyone from like data scientists who work with a lot of unstructured text or images. Um, a lot of librarians actually get a lot of joy out of using Atlas because it's the first time they can like see their entire like digitized archive collections all in one place. Kind of one of the beauties of Atlas is that the links that you make are shareable. So if you upload 1 million documents, you can just copy paste that link to somebody else, and then they can see your 1 million documents, but in a way that they can start exploring it themselves.
And can Atlas also be used by more amateur AI builders as well?
Yeah, yeah. So like the whole point of Atlas is to be able to go in and do exploration of data sets without having to even put up any money. We offer like a very generous free tier, like 50,000 data points. You can just go in and for most sort of amateur builders who are like tinkering with their own models, that's more than sufficient sort of like to get started. We also offer a pretty big tier for like researchers, for example. Researchers can go in. We grant them large data sets they can put in. They can use part of their research projects.
And so if anybody watching this video wants to take advantage of the 50,000 credits, how would they do that?
Here's the secret. You just sign up and you start using it.
Perfect.
It's already there. You
Okay.
have it.
Awesome. Okay, so at a certain point, and I think it was released a few weeks ago, you had the idea of GPT for all. So I want to learn about how, from you're building Nomic, you have the Atlas product out in market. When did you first think to train your own local model? And we can even take it from a higher level. What is GPT for all? But first, I want to hear about how this creation came to be.
Yeah, sure. So I guess I'll start at the high level. GPT4All is a large language model that you can run locally on your computer. You don't need a GPU. You don't even need that fast of a computer. It only takes a little bit of RAM, which is sort of like the memory your computer has, to get going. And it's not as good as, for instance, like the sort of OpenAI chat. It's not as good right now as the OpenAI chat or like GPT-4, but it can do a lot of the same things that these sort of like in cloud offerings can do. But you don't have to send your data to kind of like a third party. Everything runs locally on your computer. You have the privacy there. You can run it in your internal systems if you wanted to, if you were at a company. Um, so that's what GPT4All is. It's a GPT model that isn't that it's a large language model that isn't bound by some third party that you have to go through to get access to that foundational technology that large language models give you. So kind of how we got started with it is, like I said, the whole reason we built Atlas in the first place is because we sort of made this key realization that the secret to making good large language models is high quality, clean, curated data. And we were building out Atlas, and nobody really cared about large language models up until like the general public didn't really care about or know about the existence of large language models as this sort of like pivotal new technology that was going to dawn in this new era of like a new
And
type of.
when was this?
This was when did people start
Like
realizing?
when? Yeah, when did people start? I mean, I kind of know the answer to it.
I would say like October of 2022, November of
Yeah,
2022. So we were about
yeah,
6 months into building Atlas at this point. And so for about 6 months we were working on Atlas, and we knew that this problem existed. We knew that like higher quality, clean data sets contributed to better large language models. The problem is like nobody cared about large language models. So there was like sort of this mute point of like what is this pretty scatter plot that you're showing me? Like this looks so cool, but like I don't quite see how it's useful. That we would get a lot. Then everything sort of like we were basically early to building this thing out, which was cool because we had it built out when the world realized how important this new foundational technology of the
yeah.
large language model would be to every part of like the software stack. Um, so at about that time is when we started thinking about, okay, maybe it's about time to sort of like demonstrate that, hey, Atlas is actually the tool that you can use to curate your high quality data sets for your large language model trains. Um, and the issue is that a lot of people still couldn't access the technology even if we made one at that point. There to run a large language model typically, this is like honestly before March of 2023, like a month ago from the recording of this video, you needed to have a GPU, which cost you a couple $1,000s that plugged into your computer, or you needed to rent one for a couple dollars an hour from like a online cloud provider, and that was just like beyond the reach of most people in the world. Most people in the world couldn't have access. Um, and the access that you could have, for example, through an API like OpenAI um, or Anthropic or Cohere, the issue with them is that they were blocked in a lot of countries. Like China didn't have access, Russia didn't have access. Um, uh, yeah, there's a lot of countries. Italy has banned access, for example. There's just a lot of these blockers around even getting access to this technology. So we started thinking like, hey, what can we do? How can we go about like getting something that is not only a demonstration of the power of Atlas and its data cleaning abilities, but also something that can actually be beneficial to like end people who would use this model. So what we did is we did nothing. We waited, and magically, this Facebook dropped this GPL license model called Llama, which is probably the best foundation model that exists, whose weights anyone can Well, you can access it through a license. They've been linked on the internet. You should still probably go through Facebook to ask for them. It's the ethical thing to do.
Yeah.
And that model proved to be this sort of good foundation to be able for you to be able to fine tune large language models from to create your own, for instance, like chatbot like systems. And there was a kind of a group of hackers that emerged. One guy from Bulgaria, this guy, his GitHub is Gerganov, who started working on this CPU compatible version of Llama that runs really, really fast without the need of a GPU to be in your computer. Um, and what this basically does is it unlocks the utilization of these models for a gigantic class of people who just didn't have access to the resources to run them before. So we kind of realized this. We saw the Alpaca model's success in being able to take this and fine tune the model on a data set and then release it to everyone. We were like, okay, I think we can do this one step better because we have this tool Atlas to be able to curate the gigantic data set that is needed to actually make a strong assistant type model. So that's what we did. We sort of basically were in the right place in the right time with the right set of ingredients, put them all together, and we released GPT4All a couple Tuesdays ago. And the one kind of thing that we did that made it different from everything else is we released sort of like a one-line command you can run and then magically on your computer you have the model running locally. And sort of like this, like remove this sort of like extra friction that everyone else had around using these sort of like on CPU models that existed. And that's sort of like one thing that we did by removing the friction, by giving like a very, very succinct set of instructions to use it, causes basically explosion of people acknowledging the fact that, hey, these models are not just these magical black boxes that exist in the cloud of OpenAI or whatever other large language model provider. You can run these on your own computers. You can have access to this technology yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when I first saw GPT4All, I was absolutely blown away, thinking, about 4 GB of hard drive space was really all I needed, somewhat of a modern-ish computer. And I can have a pretty darn good model running locally on any device. Did you think it was gonna take off or be adopted at the rate it did? Because I mean, when I put out the video about it, that video got a ton of views, especially for my relatively small channel. And so many people were into it, and so many people were downloading it and installing it. Did you expect that?
Yeah, we had everything completely planned out. No, okay. I'm kidding. Of course not. Like our intention was to basically do a demonstration that like clean data is the recipe to success when you want to train a large language model. It was just we did these few extra steps that made it very easy for everyone to have access to the kind of artifact that we made. Um, and it also sort of opened my eyes to this sort of idea that there's a large collection of people, also companies, who really don't like the current model for accessing
Yeah.
this fundamental technology. They don't like the idea that they have to send their data in like API requests and have that data be done. Have these companies do whatever they do with that data and store it. They don't like the idea that all of their employees are putting their company's private data into this like chat interface that gets soaked into
Yeah.
into a few companies' hands. People really want access to this technology because there's a real paradigm shift happening right now in the developer world. If you're building an app that doesn't have a large language model plugged in, you're going to be behind the curve.
Yeah.
But there's many applications that just fundamentally don't allow for data to be sent externally from. Maybe they don't have internet access. And it really started opening up my eyes to like the kind of pent up demand that the world had for something that people can run without having to jump through a third party's sort of like net to use.
And I think a lot of people are just liking to hack on it too. They want something locally that they can play with rather than just kind of a walled off API to hit. So I think that's probably part of its popularity is the fact that yeah, you have it on your own computer and you can
Yep.
fine tune it, you can mess with it, you can play around with it and extend it. That at least that's exciting for me.
Yeah.
And
The
please.
other sort of big thing is we made a very strong point to do everything in the most open way possible. Usually, when people release, let's say, like a machine learning model or a paper about a machine learning model, they don't release sort of like the whole set of things. They
Yeah.
release some subsets. So they'll release the model weights, or they'll release the paper. Hopefully, they'll release the data too. But usually, for most large language models that people train, the data is a secret sauce. The data is what companies hold dear to them. The data is usually taken from sources that the companies don't have copyright to, so they actually can't release it without putting themselves in like a legal gun pointing situation. So they don't release it. Um, we were very adamant about releasing the entire stack. We truly believe that this technology can only grow fast and can only grow in the right direction and can only grow in a safe direction if the whole community had its eyes on it while it was being built. And that's why we released it, data included, all for free to the world.
Yeah, I mean, this feels like the very early days of the internet. I was pretty young at the time, but there was AOL, which essentially was the internet, and then all of a sudden, broadband and the browsers took over, and then that is why we have a vibrant internet now. So I want to say I really appreciate that you put that out and you open sourced everything. Um, and I also want to say congrats. You launched version 2, which is based on GPTJ. We'll talk about that in a moment. But I want to talk a little bit about specifics of GPT4All. And Maybe this is actually a good jumping off point to jump into your new launch, which came out yesterday. Um, First, talk about the differences, and then I put out a video yesterday about GPT4All J, which also version 2 we'll call it. And there were a bunch of people who had questions, and I'd love to go through some of those questions as well with you. So first,
Yeah.
let's talk about what's the difference. What did you launch?
Yeah, sure. So GPT4All, the original model, it was trained from an existing large language model. So train means fine-tune in this case.
Hmm.
So we collected a large data set of responses from OpenAI's Assistant API. And then we continued training the large language model that Facebook released called Llama on this data set to teach it to be how to be an assistant. An assistant is sort of like the kind of interface that you see when you interact with a large language model through like chat.openai.com, for example.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, we paid OpenAI for the data. It's the data back to us. They have a clause in their terms of service that says you can't build a competing product with us. We weren't trying to build a competing product. We were releasing this out for research purposes for the world to interact with and use. Um, and the model was released. The model itself, the GPT4All model, can't actually be the original one. Can't actually be used for commercial purposes because that model is derived from GPL licensed, the GPL licensed Llama model. So the weights of the Llama model are under this thing called the GNU public license, which allows researchers to use it. But if you want to use it for commercial purposes, you have to talk to Facebook.
And
Um,
so to interrupt for a second, so you built your fine-tuned model on top of the Llama model, meaning
yep.
that your fine-tuned model inherited that license.
Exactly, exactly. A
Okay.
condition of the GNU General Public License is that derived works inherit that licensing, and
Okay.
we wanted to respect that. And we plastered it everywhere. It's at your own risk if you use that original model in some setting that breaks that license. Um, for example, if you were to go to build a big business over that model, what would happen is that Facebook can come after you. Who knows if they would, but that's a risk. You're breaking the license. Now, the very first thing we did when we realized that people cared about large language models that they owned and that ran on their hardware and that ran with their data, um, is we set out to sort of fix this licensing issue. Because there was just basically a whole swath of people who wanted to start building immediately without having to rely on these like third-party dependencies or sending their data to third-party services, and they couldn't because building was basically stopped by the fact that, hey, I can't build anything that might potentially like make someone money because of this license. So we set out to build over top of a backbone, so this sort of foundation model that was not GPL licensed. So we chose, just for starters, this model called GPTJ. GPTJ is a large language model that's trained over top of this data set called the pile. The pile is just a conglomeration of like a bunch of the internet scraped down. There's, for example, the Enron emails from the from publicly released Enron cases in there. There's a bunch of stuff. You can find it on the Hugging Face website if you want to look at the contents of it. We also have some Atlas maps of it because
And
we were
that is an open source model in itself.
yeah.
Like
So
all
that
the
model
data
was
is, or sorry, the pile is completely open. Anybody can get access to that.
yeah. So anyone can get access to the pile. Calling the pile open source is difficult. Calling data in general open source is difficult. Most of these large language models that have been trained by people are riddled with copyrighted data going into them.
Mm.
Every single large language model that you've used likely has been trained on data that's copyrighted. And there's probably gigantic legal cases that will be fought over the next coming decade about this. But
Yeah.
this is just like the reality of things. There's no way to prevent this. People are scraping the internet to train these models. So kind of besides that point, GPTJ was released with an Apache 2 license by Luther AI a few years ago. It's certainly not the best model. It's certainly like qualitatively and quantitatively in terms of metrics a worse model than Llama, but it's also a model that the world can build on. So we took basically we were hoping to ship it fast out to the world so they can have a model that they can build on that's openly licensed. The issue is that the model was kind of a worse quality, so it required a lot more, say, work on our end and iteration on our end to get something that would have quality that people would be happy to interact with and get some utility from. So we had to increase the amount of data we were putting into the fine tuning process of the model. We had to do a lot more data set curation. We actually made a bunch of Atlas maps in the middle to sort of like help us debug the model while we were training, because the model was basically learning to memorize things as opposed to learning to like generalize like an assistant, due to like the data composition. There were kind of a bunch of like technical machine learning problems that we had to sort of solve, machine learning and data problems that we had to solve to get that model out. But we actually released it yesterday. So it's so there was okay. So there was technical machine learning and data problems to be solved. There was also this new element that we had access to, that allowed us to actually ship it, and that's this 8,000, 9,000 person now community on Discord, that all believe in what the GPT4All movement is doing, who are contributing their time and effort to help us actually make this possible. It would have been impossible to release the GPTJ model without certain key members of that community who sort of stood up and dedicated and contributed and donated tons of their time, to the effort.
What were they actually doing?
Uh,
How can
every
people contribute?
Yeah, so like every people were contributing everything from like suggestions on data, like what they wanted to see this new model be able to do. They were also contributing their actual like developer hours. So there's some brilliant developers who are in the community, um, and we sort of like gave them some like rough suggestions on like these are the things that we think should exist.
Mhm.
So the actual code that makes the Llama model, for instance, run really fast on GPU, on CPU. So like the GPT4All model that's based on Llama run really fast on CPU. You can't actually use that same code to make GPTJ run fast on CPU. So there was this one developer who went in and wrote a completely custom version of the CPU code, all in like a very,
Wow.
very low level programming language from scratch. Well, he not exactly from scratch. He derived it from the existing code, but he had to do hundreds of lines of code alterations, and it's very complicated code to write. And he did this all for a free and open LLM feature. And it would not have been possible with the community's contribution to do this. Um, so like there were several sort of difficulties that existed that had to be implemented to get a Apache 2 license model out there to the world that runs fast on CPU, which is what people need, because if the model does not run fast on CPU, its utility to 99.99% of the people is like nil.
Yeah, I mean, when I installed the new model a few days ago, that was one of the first things I noticed was it was very fast. I already thought GPT-4 was pretty fast, but yeah, certainly the new model seems very fast. So let's go into some questions. I mean, I had a bunch of people ask questions.
Yep.
Letting them know I'm talking to an AI leader, and then also, especially after releasing the video yesterday about GPT4All J, they had quite a few questions, and so I'd love to dive into those with you.
Please, yeah.
So you mentioned just now it's powered by a CPU. A lot of people wanted to know how can they actually power it with a GPU. Is that possible? Is that coming if it's not possible?
Yeah. So we actually released the raw model weights that are, so like to get a model running fast on CPU, there's this process called quantization that you have to run, which basically takes the like 30 gigabyte file that contains all the model's parameters, and makes that file a lot smaller, but still
Mhm.
preserves the quality that the parameter at the model weights have, so that the model is still good when it's smaller. Um, is the way I would describe that process at the high level. Um, and what what we were able to do is we put the model through that process that was running on CPU, but we actually also released the actual end model weights, the ones the 25 gigabyte, 30 gigabyte parameter, 30 gigabyte file of model weights. And those model weights, you can natively put those onto a GPU and run them, no problem at high speed. Now that's something that you'd have to do yourself. You have to be a little bit technical to do that. But there is, in the short-term roadmap, there's definitely the desire from the community, and also people in the community who are currently working on it, to implement like GPU support into that sort of like launcher that we released, that chat interface that you saw with the GPT4All J launch.
Awesome. Okay, and during the installation process, you get a couple warnings,
Yep.
unverified developer warnings.
Yeah.
Some people said, hey, this looks like a scam, or
It's a virus,
just
right?
right. Obviously, we spoke, so I knew where it was coming from. I knew Nomic as a company.
Yep.
Maybe just briefly talk about why it says that, and why people should trust the download link.
Yeah. I mean, so like you guys are working on the bleed. You guys are interacting with something that's on the bleeding edge of what's possible to translate from research to a useful object that you can interact with like all of human history's knowledge on a single file. Um, Unfortunately, Apple and Microsoft don't work that fast. So we are waiting to get the certificate signed from Apple and Microsoft, and in a couple days, you will not get those security warnings when installing the file.
Okay, so it's as simple as you're moving faster than you can get approval
Yes,
from the operating systems.
yes,
Okay.
and we bias towards releasing it, getting feedback, starting iterating early before waiting for all the I's to dot and the T's to cross, and then getting that feedback.
So going back to GPU usage, another thing that a ton of people want to know about is fine tuning the models on their own data.
Yep,
I know GPT4All, the original, had some instructions for doing that. I know it requires a pretty high-end GPU or cloud GPU.
yep.
What's the plan for the new version of it in terms of fine tuning? And then maybe you can touch on briefly, like high level, what does that flow look like? If I wanted to say, if I have 100 documents and I want to fine tune a model on it, what does that high level process look like?
Yes, this is something a lot of people have asked for. Unfortunately, it's a kind of a complex question to get right, because there's the one question of like, can I fine tune this? There's another question of, can I fine tune this to get something higher quality? There's another question of, can I fine tune this on my own data and actually get a model that still acts like the previous model but just knows a little bit more about my data? There's a lot of layers to this question. I would say the best answer is, so number one, GPT4All J. The instructions to train the model are all in that GitHub README, the GPT4All GitHub README. You can go there. There's a single command you can run. If you rent a big enough machine with GPUs from a company like Paperspace, you get the ability to train it yourself. Now there's a question about like, hey, can I do this for cheaper? Do I have to spend a bunch of money on GPUs? Unfortunately, right now, answer that question is no. Uh, you still will need to have a GPU or a few GPUs if you want to train with a lot of data, because you need a lot of data to get a high quality model out. You will still need GPUs to train it. Unfortunately, training like deep neural networks, these models are gigantic. Just the model itself, to like load it up onto your computer's memory, you need to have like RAM that's like 32 gigabytes of RAM just to load the raw model weights up that you'll be training. This is like not consumer grade hardware that most people have. Like the actual raw GPT4All J model. If we didn't put it through the whole process that makes it run fast on CPU, you would likely not be able to load that model up on your like max memory.
And so maybe when a lot of people think they want to fine tune a model, they're possibly just talking about giving the model access to additional context. Like
Yep,
I
yep.
have this PDF or I have this Excel document that has a lot of my personal information on it. I want to be able to ask questions about that document. So maybe rather than fine tuning the model, what they should be doing is thinking about, how do I plug this data or give it additional context? Maybe you could speak to that a little bit, how they might do that either with the old model and or the newer one.
Yep. Yeah, so you're exactly right. If your goal is to get some usefulness out of the model, to like solve a task, like I don't know, letting you answer questions about some PDF document you have, whose text you have accessible, likely what you want to do is not actually fine tune the model, so that is keep training the model. So what you can do is something called retrieval augmented generation. And what this means is you ask the model. You're able to give the model a bunch of, basically a prefix of information that you want it to use when it's answering your question, and then you can ask your question afterwards. So you can prompt the model with a bunch of information, and then you can ask it a question about that information, and it'll give you. And if the model is good enough, it'll give you an answer. Now, if you have a lot of information, so imagine you have like a dozen PDF documents or 2 dozen PDF documents, you have to do some more clever things. And usually, what you want to do, if you're just getting started and you want like a good tutorial on this, the best place to go is this this like large language model ecosystem building app building ecosystem called LangChain. LANG chain. And what they do is they give you sort of like recipes with like really, really readable and human interpretable tutorials on how you can get started using these. So GPT4All is actually integrated into LangChain. You can use it as a model backend. And they give you
Awesome.
all these great tutorials on how you can do this sort of like retrieval augmented prompting to allow you to get some of the benefits of that you would get from fine tuning a model without having to actually like spend your money on GPUs and this sort of thing.
Okay. And so if somebody did want to fine tune a model, what would they need to actually output something that is better than what the base model already is?
Um, yeah, so likely what you would need is you'd have to first rent a giant machine that has 8 GPUs attached to it called a DGX A100. Um, and this machine costs like a couple $100,000, I think $100,000, $200 to actually buy outright. But you can rent it for like $12 to $25 an hour depending on your provider. I'd recommend Paperspace if you're. The reason I'm recommending Paperspace is because they actually helped sponsor GPT4All and getting the models trained. We would not have been able to move as fast without them. So I'm really thankful for the team there. Um, they you can rent a machine from them. You then need to have data that's properly formatted to keep like training an assistant. And now what it means to properly format data to training an assistant, it means you need to have basically examples of conversations that the model can learn from. So examples of conversations over top of your data. So you would give, for example, a some section of one of your PDFs. You ask a question about it, and then you would have to write that answer, and you would need probably a couple thousand examples like that. So quite a large number of examples to be able to like effectively fine tune one of your models to make that work. Now, that's a thing that's a large technical lift. The everyday person should not be expected to be able to do that. And I can assure you the ecosystem over the next like 4 to 6 months will develop such that this becomes a more and more accessible thing for everyday people to do.
Okay. Now, a couple quick questions. People are asking about multiple languages. Does GPT-J handle multiple languages? Does it handle it well? Which languages does it handle? And if not, what's the plan?
Yeah, I mean, so like a GPT4All should be able to support every language. It should be able to support everyone. The world is not just English.
Yeah.
Um, Now, to support more multiple languages, kind of like two parts of that recipe. Part number one is you need to take a foundation model. So you need to take that sort of like base backbone architecture, so like GPT-J or Llama, and that model needs to be trained to learn about different languages. And the way you do that is you make sure that the data you're collecting to pre-train that model with, to sort of teach it about language, has a diversity of languages inside of it. And then the next step is to make sure that when you're fine tuning the model to be an assistant or to follow instructions, for example, you need to make sure that you have questions and answers that are not just English. That's the way you do it. And these are all in the, again, short-term roadmap for the next model iteration. We're growing the data set by the hour, and we're growing the diversity of the data set by the hour as well. So yeah.
Okay. All right. Great. Yeah. I mean, access for everybody all over the world, regardless of language, is definitely important. And another question that I got quite often is, what's the max token length?
Yeah. So what does that mean, I guess, to sort of like prefix. So max token length means roughly how many words you can put in to the model before it doesn't know about the previous words that you gave it when it's sort of like giving you an answer. Um, and a token is roughly on average two and a half. Sorry, a word is roughly on average 1.5 to 2 tokens. That's so like the way computers sort of like encode in text is a little bit different than the way you'd, for example, split like a sentence on like spaces or like on periods or something like this. And the rough equivalent is like one English word would be like roughly like 1.5 to 2 tokens on average. So for instance, like the word like supercalifragilisticexpialidocious might be like 8 tokens. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. And
Okay,
so what?
okay. So I didn't answer the question. Yeah.
Oh
So what
yeah.
is this? Yeah.
Please.
What is the context window? It's 2,048 tokens, and this is small compared to like a large language model you can use, for instance, like via like an API, like OpenAI or Anthropic's model, for example. But there are plans in the medium to short-term future to be able to have models that support much longer token lengths, obviously.
And does that token length include both the prompt and the response, or is
Yep.
that
Yep.
separate? Okay, so
Yeah.
that's an important
It
distinction. So your prompt plus the response is 2048 tokens.
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
And the reason for that is The model, when you're using it, it needs to take in all the text that you given it, prompt included, response included, previous questions included, such that it can make the next most likely best answer. Uh,
Right.
yeah.
So the next topic I want to talk about, a lot of people had very strong feelings about in the comments section, and I've heard this in a lot of places, is model bias.
Yep.
First, let's talk about what is model bias. Does it exist? Does it not exist? And why does it occur? And then we can dive into like who gets to decide and so on. So I'd love to hear kind of the high level about, is there model bias, and how does that actually happen?
Yep. Yeah, so this is a topic that obviously a lot of people have a lot of opinions on, and there's many schools of thought, and a lot of these schools of thought fight with each other all the time. Um, but I think about it like this. Um, so a model's biases are functions of the data that the model was trained on. So if a data set is biased and a machine learning model is trained on that data set, the model is not going to magically learn to ignore those biases. It's going to inherit them. This is why, for example, in the example that I mentioned about the credit scoring, right? You would learn the credit scoring model is very susceptible to picking up biases about data it was trained on, conditioning on spurious correlations in the data set to do things that maybe humans wouldn't perceive as like acceptable. For instance, like take one group of people and always reject them for alone as compared to another group of people. Large language models are not any different. They are machine learning models trained on large amounts of text, and they learn the biases in their underlying data. You can go in and actually there's tons of papers out there that compare, for example, the way the sex that a large language model assigns to different like job roles. For example, if you go in and ask like what is the name of this nurse, and then you let the large language model continue it, it's much more likely to put a woman's name versus a man's name, and vice versa. For example, like a plumber. And this is just a fact because these are the kind of biases that it's learned from the data that it's been trained on. Now, in the context of the GPT4All models, these models sort of get bootstrapped. To get bootstrapped, they needed a lot of data. The APIs that we used have a model that exists in them that we distilled the model from, and now these APIs have all the biases baked in from the creators of those models. So the original model that we released has these biases baked in as well. But the cool thing is that now that we have access to the data, and the data is open sourced, and these data can be manipulated by the community, anyone can take this data set and sort of engineer the model to be at whatever level of filtering or whatever, or have whatever biases that it wants to be. Now, this can mean bad things can happen, right? A person could engineer the model to have biases that are maybe not aligned with what most humans can want. But you can also do like vice versa as well. And like this is like a difficult topic. It's very sensitive. A lot of people like disagree with this whole idea of like releasing models out into the open, because you can have basically people can train them themselves to basically output whatever kind of biases that they want. These models can be plugged into automated systems that will, if the models have harmful biases, propagate those biases throughout the world. And my one defense to that is, would you prefer a centralized organization have all that power? I would personally prefer these models to be built out in the open for while everyone has access to seeing how these models are made. The appropriate defenses can be built if these models are built out in the open to these sort of things.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about centralization in a few minutes. I want to touch on the biases a little bit more. So when a company like Meta, who originally trained the Llama model, or Eleuther AI, GPTJ, are the engineers making decisions day to day of the biases themselves? Are they deciding, and or is the bias inherent in the data that's being put together, and that's just the way the world is, or the way that the data reflects the way the world is?
Yeah, I mean, Matt, you know the answer to this question. Like, no one's gonna purposely go in and try to inject some sort of bias into a model and then like try to hide it or something like this. One of these organizations. It's a function of just sort of the data that exists on the internet. And if you train on parts of the internet that have like content that people would generally find like immoral or like not good, the model will have those biases as well. Um, yeah, but the thing that does happen though is when you train a model to be an assistant and have assistant-like behavior, that requires a very high level of curation of the data, and those models are specifically engineered. to have certain types of biases, and those biases are usually viewed as like generally good by people, by governments, and that's why the models have those biases. For instance, like if you look at OpenAI's model, it'll refuse to respond to you when you ask it to do things that are maybe illegal, or maybe if it's uncertain about something, for instance, like giving medical advice, it'll refuse to do that, which is arguably a good thing. But also, you have no alternative if you have a use case, for example, where you needed to use the model to do something that required, for instance, like maybe like fake medical advice, because maybe, I don't know, you wanted to make a game or something like this. Then you're completely out of luck.
And so it sounds like all models have bias because the data that is building the models have the bias. Um, should people expect more or less bias in a local model versus a cloud model like ChatGPT?
Um, I think like quantitatively qualifying if you should expect more or less bias. You can't make this like a blanket statement. The biases in a model are the biases that the trainers of the model have instilled in it, especially if you have like an assistant like model or an instruction following model. Um, and you just need to be cognizant of the data that model was trained on. This is why we open source the data set for GPT4All, and this is why we put it into a viewer that didn't require you to like page through every single data point, but you can see all the data points pre-organized in a view that lets you immediately go in and say, hey, that data shouldn't be in there. Because yeah, in
Right.
our original release, we did a lot of work curating the data. We didn't do a perfect job. There were tons of people who were looking at the Atlas map and saying, "Hey, this data shouldn't be in there. That would put a bad bias into the model, or a bias that doesn't align with what we're doing." And that's the kind of criticism that should be happening. That's the whole point. It's the whole point of releasing the data.
Yeah, and so help me understand. There's bias in the data, and then there's filtering, and those are two different things, right?
No, they're all the same thing. Filtering is just another word of like going through and like manipulating the bias to be like slightly different. For
And
example,
so, please.
So, for example, if you wanted to train an AI model that doesn't always say as an AI language model, so for example, if you have a data set that is one's like the ones collected from OpenAI, that model has a certain type of bias instilled into it. Any model that you train from that data set will also learn to have that bias. Now, you can manipulate that data set that you received from one of these like cloud providers to not have one of those biases by manipulating the underlying data. So, for example, if I was to go in and remove all the data points that have this as an AI language model line, the model would be less likely to refuse to respond, for example, in certain scenarios.
So in the nurse example that you gave,
Yep.
like give me the name of a nurse. It's much more likely to give a female gender name.
Yes, Mary, for example. Yeah.
Right. But then what I thought filtering was, and just please correct me, is if, for ChatGPT, if you ask, how do I produce a drug, any
Yep.
drug, right? And it's not going to tell you. So that is different from the bias. And what would you call that? Or is that
I
also the
that
bias?
that's the same thing. Um, that filtering is a form of bias in itself. You're filtering to align to a set of moral standards or a set of legal standards. That's injecting that bias in.
Got it. So
Yeah,
there can be bias not only in the original data, but applied afterwards by whoever's creating the original model, fine tuning the model. It's just all
precisely.
layers of
Yep,
bias.
yep.
And so if somebody is asking for an unfiltered version of GPT for all, what are they going to get? And is there still going to be bias in it? I mean, we kind of talked about the answer, but I want to
Yeah.
hear it from you.
Yeah, so I mean, every model will always have bias. If you like a model that responds to more things and isn't hesitant, there's a way to make a model that is less biased towards doing that. An example is removing all the data points during training, which say like, "Hey, I can't respond to this query because of X, Y, and Z." And that's actually what we did. What we just did. So, for example, we released the model yesterday. Overnight, it was clear people were not liking how restrictive it was. So we kicked off a train, and in a couple hours, there will be a model that people can use and interact with that is a little bit less restrictive. Um, but the sort of big demonstration here is that once you have things out in the open, it's very, very easy to make these sort of data interventions. But there's also bad sides to it. Like I'm not gonna sit here and like try to like prophesize like the beauty and like how the whole world's going to be amazing because like data sets are open. Like this does open up avenues to like bad things happening. But I truly believe that by opening up avenues for people to interact and visual and be able to understand the data sets that these models are trained with, it'll allow us to arm ourselves as like humans to be able to combat like bad actors using this technology. One thing that comes to mind all the time is like this idea of like I call this bring your own bias. So this is like, for example, maybe a company like Pepsi really wants the world to drink a lot of Pepsi. So what they could do is they could pay some creator of a large language model to replace the word Coke with Pepsi in all of the data that it ever sees that gets trained on. So whenever you ask the model when you're working with it to help you, like, I don't know, write an email or something like this, and you ask it to like write an email to tell your friend to get you a drink, well, that drink will always be Pepsi no matter what, which is obviously very useful for Pepsi as a company because they'll sell more Pepsi. But this sort of thing will happen in the next decade. It probably already is happening, and it's just something that you can't prevent. But there are systems that can be built, and there are researchers currently working on it when the data is open to be able to sort of mitigate the harmful effects of these sort of things.
Okay, so that dovetails really nicely into the centralization discussion. Um, OpenAI is fully centralized. GPT4All is open sourced. Talk a little bit just what is the difference, and we've touched on it a lot, but let's summarize like why does it matter, and should there be two options, and then let's I want to hear from you, like why is decentralization so important to you?
Yeah, I mean, so look, I'm not attempting to like like my objective is not to like disparage these large companies. They provide a big value to society. They first demonstrated that you can take this sort of like foundational technology and put it into a useful form that humans can generally like use as co-pilots in everyday lives. Like there's tons of applications being built over top of the ecosystem. There are tons of amazing, useful things that you can do with the help of models like models produced by like OpenAI, Anthropic, and Cohere. Like they're doing great services. But when these companies were originally formed, they were kind of formed under a different ethos than they're operating over now. If you go look at the original OpenAI charter from like 2016 or 2017, their goal was to be a company that can safely drive humanity into an era where an AGI exists and make sure that it doesn't do bad things, and that humanity doesn't like get destroyed because somebody builds a technology that because the technology doesn't get out of hand. Is a way to summarize that thing. Um, and the issue is that over the years, because of like financial reasons, obviously, like they got more and more restrictive. They got more and more closed source. They started sharing models less and less. The last model that they actually released to the public for anyone to use was GPT-2, I believe. Maybe don't quote me on that, but that's the last large language model that they released. After GPT-3, that model was held behind their API, and they would only release, for example, like a paper about it, a paper detailing like this is the rough thing that we did to train it. This is kind of what the data looks like. This is kind of how we clean the data. This is what the model can do. And here's this little place where you can send a computer request to, and out comes the model output. And then people started using these systems. ChatGPT came out. They gave sort of like this like human interface layer to these models that made them useful assistants that people can paste in their problems and maybe get someone to like sit on there, basically sit by them and help them answer it. That's basically what ChatGPT is. It's a co-pilot that you can use to help you solve your everyday problems, whatever that may be. Their plugin system is like an addition to this, right? But then GPT-4 came out, and GPT-4 I think is when the research community got really, really scared of what was happening, because that was the first time when they didn't publish an academic paper, but published sort of a marketing paper. It was a 96-page white paper that was basically without a dataset section, without a methods section, and they actually explicitly said that we're not releasing any of that information because of competitive reasons. There's other large language model companies that exist that they're in competition with. And that was sort of like the thing that gave me the initial like jump to, hey, like we should reconsider letting this just kind of slide. We should look at alternatives. And that's actually the thing that the reason I started building GPT4All and kind of got the team at Nomic behind it, and then eventually the whole community behind it, was because of the GPT-4 paper. Like that's not how the world should operate. That technology should not be sectioned off away from the majority of humans for use. You shouldn't need an internet connection to use that technology. And that's just like that was just the state of the world.
So that makes a lot of sense, and one argument for centralization that I've heard, not necessarily that I agree with, but that I've heard, is that when everybody has their own models, they're much more easily abused and able to use for nefarious purposes. Can you steelman that argument? Do you agree with that argument? And maybe give me a steelman for the centralization argument.
Yeah, I mean, so like that's 100% true. But in the very same vein, like it's very clear that these large language model companies are more and more aligning their efforts with like capitalistic efforts. So like they are taking in they are allowing sort of like economic threats to bias how they are acting in the world. And who's to say these companies in a few years, if the whole system stays centralized, won't be doing things that are sort of generally not good for all of the world. And like I don't suspect that they would, but there's nothing to stop them from doing that. The only way to stop it is putting these models in everyone's hands. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, light is the best disinfectant, and there is a world which centralized models and edge models can coexist and
Oh,
should. And
I think they
it's
will.
competing with each other. It's keeping each other honest.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like in its current state, edge LLMs, like GPT4All and the other various ones in the edge LLM sort of like ecosystem that's been built out over the last 2 months, um, they don't serve as a piece of competition to these large language model companies. They are like they are uniformly worse in capabilities than, like, for instance, like the Chat GPT API that you can interact with, or GPT-4. They are uniformly probably harder to use, but they're also uniformly more open because you can actually use them anywhere. You can go in and put them on a Raspberry Pi or like a small little computer and take them into a place with no internet, and then you have access to this technology that you wouldn't otherwise have access to. You could build a business around these things and not have to worry about OpenAI upping the prices in 2 years when you built your whole business around it, and then like squeezing you until
That's a
you
really good
couldn't
point.
operate anymore. Like,
Platform risk.
yeah, there's many reasons why you want to own the hardware your computers run on. Privacy, for example, as well. Many companies have banned the use of ChatGPT internally, because all the employees were just the technology was so useful that all the employees were just sending all the sensitive company data over to OpenAI. Um,
Right.
and companies need these technologies. They will fall behind their competitors if they don't use these technologies, large language models. But they don't get access to them because of data privacy concerns, which OpenAI is like trying to fix and amend. But yeah,
All right. So you've mentioned that these local models are not yet comparable to OpenAI's models or other centralized models. What will it take to get there? Any predictions on timeline? And that kind of leads into the point of data sharing, which you're, by the way, folks are already sharing their data with OpenAI. Every single time you put in a request, they are logging that. They're using it to train future models. So uh, people who are kind of concerned about giving their data to an open source company, why should they not be concerned? And again, what is it going to take to get local models on par with centralized models?
yeah. So the secret sauce to having a model that works as good as GPT-4, but you can run on your computer, is a lot of high quality curated data of examples of you interacting with an assistant model, that go in and get edited such that good responses, where when the model responds well, you have reinforced that response. When the model hasn't like elaborated enough on something, you change it. This is the internal process that OpenAI did to get a very high quality sort of assistant style data set that they train these models on. That's part of the secret sauce, and that's what the community can help out on. The community can help by, whenever you use a GPT4All model, opting in to share your data. This is not something that is on by default, but you can opt in. and your data will be shared with something we're calling the GPT4All open source data lake. It's a collection of basically all the data that everyone has opted to share for the improvement of future GPT4All models. And this data lake, data in it is constantly accessible. It's constantly visible to everyone, constantly downloadable by everyone. So not only, for example, people in the GPT4All community, researchers have access to it to improve their systems. And it is the place where many organizations are sending data already.
Is there any way to identify a single individual from in the data lake based on their prompt? Is it anonymized?
So there's various levels of like permissions. If you would like sort of like your data to be tracked back to you because you want credit, for example, to if you want the credit that your data contributed to like these open models, you can tick that box and you'll be able to, excuse me, you'll be able to have that information associated with you. It's all you can anonymize it to sort of every extent, and we're trying our best to adhere to all sort of like international laws around sort of data privacy. For instance, if you're in Europe, you can delete your data once it's been submitted to adhere with European laws, and this sort of thing. Yeah. So the other piece of the secret sauce is actually something that's very, very hard for the community to do. And this is something that a company like OpenAI was specifically sort of built from the ground up to be able to do. That is, invest a lot of capital to do a large pre-training of a gigantic model with hundreds of billions of parameters over as much data as you can possibly gather from the entire world. And they were specifically well capitalized from the very beginning to be able to do this. They received, I think, over $1 billion in investments throughout their lifetime to iterate, to experiment, to push the cutting edge, because this technology did not exist before OpenAI. They contributed fundamentally to the existence of large language models. Without them, large language models likely would not have come as fast. They did amazing things for the world. And to get a good quality on edge large language model that can do useful things for you, maybe is even comparable with ChatGPT 3.5 or GPT4. An organization needs to go in and sort of do that same work, but instead of holding it closed source, release it, or OpenAI needs to release it. One of those.
Yeah. And let's talk about edge models again. I've seen some incredible implementations of GPT4All. People are sharing them on Twitter, and they're on devices that I would have never expected. What is the coolest device that you've seen GPT4All installed on?
Yeah, so like the model itself requires about 4 GB of RAM to run, which kind of puts some limitations onto the like kind of device you can run it on. But what people have done is run the model on like a small CPU and then plug that model into devices like a TI-84 calculator or a DSI, and then use the interface on these devices like on the TI-84, so like thing you use in like your calculus exams, to like type in questions and get outputs out, and it streams into the calculator. All running on CPU. And the same thing with the DSs. There's we actually, so like to encourage the community to like have some fun with this, we actually put up some bounties where we offer like a couple $100, like the best use of GPT4All to the best use of GPT4All put onto like the most like insane edge device you can imagine. Like the kind of things we suggested were like toasters and microwaves. Unfortunately, people couldn't figure that out, but maybe soon.
So what you're really saying is the entirety of human knowledge basically can be put on a TI-84 calculator. Something that
So
you can just put in your pocket, go into, go anywhere you want and just start typing, and
yeah,
all of these edge devices that are really inexpensive, a huge amount of human knowledge can be put directly on them.
yeah. So not something as extreme as a TI-84 calculator that has very, very low memory. You can definitely hook a cable into a TI-84 calculator, later run the model on like an external CPU, and then interact with the model on there. But something as simple as like a very, very old phone, for example, without internet access, could run this model. And you could take it with you into the jungle and ask it like, "What should I eat this flower? Or should I not eat this flower?" and describe the flower, for example.
Amazing. I mean, that's so cool.
And it has
Okay.
it has all of humans' knowledge, most of humans' knowledge on the internet, kind of baked into it, and then queryable with human language.
I mean, I know a lot of this technology has been around and has been developing for years now, but in the last few months, it's really insane to think about how
Yep.
much we've progressed with large language models, where they're being installed, where they're being used. It's so impressive. It's so exciting.
Yeah,
I'm
we
so
stand
glad to be in that.
on the shoulders of giants, and
Absolutely.
all the ingredients just have really come together over the last few months to really make like a real societal impact with these things. Um, yeah.
So, last question for you. A couple weeks ago, an open letter came out. I think Woz signed it, Elon Musk, a bunch of notable artificial intelligence leaders, which called for a 6-month pause. I made a video about it. There's obviously reasons that Elon Musk and other AI leaders want OpenAI. Really, they're calling out OpenAI to pause their development for 6 months of LLMs that are better than GPT-4. And there's arguments that, hey, maybe that makes sense, even if it's not feasible or not even possible, because you have other states and they're not going to abide by an agreement. So where do you fall on the spectrum of full speed ahead, or let's take a second to think about what may happen if we go full speed ahead? Where do you fall on that spectrum, and why?
So I personally, so I've like skimmed the thing that was written and signed. I saw a lot of controversy around like a lot of people being claimed to have signed it, but then they're like, I never actually signed this. I'm not honestly, I honestly don't have too strong of an opinion on just like that whole letter and the whole situation that happened around it. The one thing I do have an opinion on is when people with like strong financial incentives attempt to block progress because it could help their financial incentives. And I think a lot of people in the community perceived it that way. And to be honest, I also perceived it that way originally. But I don't have like very very strong opinions either way because I'm not knowledgeable enough in sort of like the details of that. I didn't look into it too hard.
Aside from the paper, do you think that we're on a course for this technology to benefit society in the long run? Do you think, like, how big of a risk do you think AGI really poses? How are you thinking about that?
Look, Matt, I think large calls to large language models will become like operating system calls that your computer makes to like Linux or Windows or whatever the underlying operating system is on your computer. It's going to be it's going to be a fundamental unit of interacting with with your computers. These models will be pushed onto more and more constrained edge devices. They will get better as time progresses. They will get better much more rapidly. To comparable quality of these like closed source APIs that exist because the whole community is putting their efforts behind it. It's not the effort of a couple hundred people at a company. It's the effort of tens of thousands of people who truly believe that this technology should not be closed away behind the walls of some company's cloud. Um, so yeah, this technology is going to permeate everything. There's like tens of thousands of developers right now building companies and apps with this core underlying technology. Right now, they're building on the closed source APIs, and that's okay. They're good. They solve business problems for people. They help people do their jobs. They help students learn how to write. They help students learn how to learn. They're doing really good things. But also very soon you're not going to have to use closed source APIs. There's going to be models that exist out there, and if I have any say in it quickly, that that allow you to actually do some of these things without having to sort of send your data to a third party.
Andrei, I want to say thank you very much for talking to me. I want to say thank you for your work, open sourcing a GPT model. It really, I think a lot of people are following in your footsteps, and a strong open source community is going to be critical to not let a single company or a handful of companies really own all of this technology and data. If people want to use Atlas, go to Nomic AI, check it out. If you're dealing with large sets of data and you want to explore your data and help train your models, please do that. Please also download GPT4All. The new version came out yesterday, and they can find that, I believe, at GPT4All.io. Is that correct?
Yeah, GPT4All.io. The best place to go is the GitHub still.
Okay.
The ecosystem is very nascent, so it's gonna be growing. I'm sure you won't miss it if you Google it.
Cool. And of course, follow Andrei on Twitter if you want to get updates in real time on what he's working on. So yeah, thank you so much for talking to me.
Yep. Thanks everyone for I guess caring.
All right. See ya.
Bye.